The first few days were perfect. Just me, my RV, and the stillness of the wilderness surrounding Mount Shasta. No tourists, no distractions, just pure isolation. Exactly what I needed. The towering trees, their trunks wrapped in fog each morning, and the distant call of birds that most people would never hear. This was where I thrived, away from the hum of city life and endless responsibilities. A break from teaching high school history and dealing with teenagers who never appreciated the stories of old. This, Mount Shasta, was real history, real mystery. I'd come here because of the stories, local legends, strange disappearances, and rumors of a hidden cabin that never appeared in the same place twice. That was my goal, to find the lost cabin that people whispered about in town, the one that was said to hold secrets long buried by time. The first few nights were uneventful, spent reading by the fire outside the RV and hiking during the day. I'd mapped out the area in my head, confident that I could cover enough ground to find something, anything. Maybe I'd even prove the cabin existed, get a few pictures, and debunk the myths. But on the third night, things started to shift. It began with the compass. I was halfway through a long hike, heading deeper into the forest where the trees grew so dense that light barely broke through. I reached for my compass just to check my bearings, but the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. I tapped it, shook it, still spinning. That didn't make sense. My phone's GPS, which I relied on for backup, was no better. The screen showed my location jumping all over the place, like it couldn't get a fix. I told myself it was just a glitch, a dead spot, but something felt wrong. Still, I kept going. I wasn't about to let a malfunctioning compass stop me. I'd come too far, and besides, the forest was beautiful in its own eerie way. The deeper I went, the more the silence weighed on me. No wind, no animals, just the sound of my boots crunching on the leaves. I liked solitude, but this was different. The air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Then I saw it. I don't know how I missed it before. A small cabin, tucked between the trees like it had grown out of the earth itself. The wood was weathered, nearly black with age, and the roof sagged in places. There was no path leading to it, no signs of anyone having lived there for decades, maybe longer. My pulse quickened. I'd found it. The lost cabin of Mount Shasta. I couldn't believe it was real, standing right in front of me. I stood there for a long moment, debating whether to go inside. It felt wrong somehow, like the forest didn't want me there. But my curiosity got the better of me. I didn't go in right away. Instead, I circled the cabin, inspecting it, taking mental notes. There were strange markings carved into the wood, symbols I didn't recognize. I'd studied enough history to know they weren't from any language I'd ever seen. They looked ancient, almost primal. I decided to come back the next day with more supplies and a better plan. As much as I wanted to explore it right then, I knew better than to push my luck in unfamiliar territory. So I turned and hiked back to the RV, my mind racing with what I had found. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sitting outside the RV, I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see something or someone standing there. I heard noises too, soft, almost imperceptible scratching sounds coming from the woods. Once, I even thought I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the RV. But every time I looked, there was nothing. The next morning, I set out early, determined to find the cabin again. But after hours of hiking, I couldn't locate it. I retraced my steps as best as I could, following the landmarks I had noted the day before. But it was like the forest had shifted overnight. The trees looked different, the paths unfamiliar. I should have been frustrated, but instead, I felt something closer to dread. It didn't make sense. That night, things got worse, much worse. I was woken in the middle of the night by a loud, persistent scratching on the outside of the RV. My heart raced as I reached for the flashlight. The sound was deliberate, moving slowly from one side of the RV to the other, like someone, or something, was tracing the edges, searching for a way in. I flung open the door and stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold night air. Nothing. There was nothing there. But as I scanned the ground, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Bare, human-like, but distorted. The toes were elongated and the heel marks were too deep, like whoever, or whatever, had made them wasn't quite human. They led away from the RV, disappearing into the dark forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the footprints had vanished, but the sense of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees. Something waiting. Still, I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. I had to find the cabin again. I had to know what was going on. I set out once more, this time with a clear plan, marking my path as I went. Hours passed, and just when I thought I had lost the trail again, I saw it. The cabin, standing in the same clearing, as though it had been waiting for me. Only this time it looked different. The air around it felt thick, charged with some kind of energy that made my skin prickle. I approached cautiously, feeling a weight press down on me with each step. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the smell of damp wood filled my lungs. The cabin was sparse, just a single table, a chair, and an old stove. But the walls were covered in carvings, symbols, the same ones I had seen outside. They spiraled and twisted, overlapping in ways that made my head hurt to look at. I reached out to touch one of the carvings, but before I could, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crack. I spun around, heart pounding, but the door wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The air grew colder, and then I heard it. Whispering. Faint at first, but growing louder, coming from all around me. The voices were speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but they echoed inside my head, growing louder and louder until I thought my skull would split. Panicking, I threw myself at the door, slamming my shoulder against it. On the third hit, the door burst open, and I stumbled outside, gasping for breath. The whispering stopped, but the air around me was still thick with that oppressive energy. As I turned to look at the cabin, I saw it. The figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall, shadowy, and watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence screamed a warning. I wasn't meant to be here. Without thinking, I ran. My legs carried me through the forest, the trees blurring together as I sprinted back toward the RV. I didn't stop until I reached the clearing where I had parked. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door, but when I finally got inside, I locked it, collapsing onto the floor. The next morning, I knew I had to leave. Whatever was out there, whatever I had disturbed, it wasn't something I could handle. I packed up as quickly as I could, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. Panic surged through me. I tried again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I stepped outside, heart pounding, and that's when I saw them. The footprints, dozens of them, circling the RV. The same distorted, bare footprints I had seen before, and in the distance, just beyond the tree line, the shadowy figure stood, watching. I grabbed what food I had left, a bottle of water, and made my way to the edge of the clearing. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was desperate, or maybe some part of me remembered the old stories about offerings. I left the food at the base of a tree, whispered an apology, and backed away. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the air seemed to lighten, the pressure easing. I climbed back into the RV, tried the engine one last time, and it roared to life. I didn't look back as I drove away from Mount Shasta. I didn't need to. I knew I'd been lucky to get out. Some places aren't meant to be found. Some secrets are better left alone. I came to Black Hills to forget, to leave the city behind, to escape the ghosts that had followed me since I left the military. I always felt more at ease in nature, just me, my camera, and the world that didn't need explaining. It was a long way from the noise of my life, and this place felt like it held answers I didn't even know I was looking for. The Black Hills had a reputation, but I didn't care about local legends. My only plan was to capture the eerie beauty of this old, forgotten mining town hidden deep in the forest. The thought of photographing its decay, the rusted equipment, crumbling buildings swallowed by the wilderness, excited me. I'd heard whispers about strange lights appearing in the woods at night, but that was just folklore. Stories people told to keep kids from wandering off too far. I wasn't a believer in ghost stories. By the time I parked my RV in the thick of the forest, the sun was already slipping behind the hills. I stood outside, breathing in the crisp, clean air, surrounded by trees so dense they blocked out most of the remaining light. No traffic sounds, no voices, no distant hum of civilization. Just the wind, the creak of branches, and the faint smell of pine. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I spent the next day exploring the mining town. It was everything I'd hoped for. Decaying buildings, rotten wooden beams, and rusting mine carts frozen in time. The place felt eerie, as if it had been abandoned in a rush, left to be reclaimed by the forest. My camera clicked away, capturing the ghostly beauty of it all. It wasn't until my second night that things started to get strange. I was reviewing my photos in the RV when I first noticed the flickering. At first, I thought it was just a glitch in the lights, maybe a wiring issue. The RV wasn't new, and I wasn't exactly great with electrical work, but the flickering grew worse, more insistent. Then the lights cut out completely, plunging me into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, thinking maybe I could check the battery. That's when I saw it, the first light. It hovered just above the treetops, about 100 feet away. At first, I thought it was another camper's lantern or maybe a firefly, but it was too big for that. It moved slowly, almost lazily, flickering in and out. I squinted, trying to figure out what it was, but the light just floated there, shifting like it had a mind of its own. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked up my camera, adjusted the settings, and tried to snap a picture. But the image came out distorted, the light a blur of nothingness. I adjusted the focus, tried again. Nothing. The light wouldn't register properly on the camera. It was then that I realized how quiet the forest had become. The wind had died, the usual creaks and rustles of the woods were gone, and even the insects had gone silent. Just me, the darkness, and the floating light. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The light drifted deeper into the woods, bobbing slowly like it was leading me somewhere. I told myself it was ridiculous to follow. After all, I didn't know this part of the forest and I could easily get lost. But the light was mesmerizing. I felt drawn to it, like it was pulling me in. So I went. The trees closed in around me as I moved through the undergrowth, my flashlight casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and warp. The light always stayed just out of reach, flickering ahead of me, beckoning. After what felt like an hour, I found myself standing in a small clearing, and there, in the middle, was an old, crumbling cabin. I hadn't seen it on any of my hikes earlier in the day. The cabin looked ancient, abandoned for decades at least, its roof sagging, walls covered in moss and rot. But what caught my attention wasn't the cabin itself. It was the lantern sitting on the table inside, glowing faintly, like it had been left there just moments before. I stood frozen for a moment, torn between curiosity and a growing sense of unease. The logical part of me said to turn around and head back to the RV. But the part of me that had been chasing answers my whole life needed to know more. I stepped inside. The air was damp and cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the summer night outside. The inside of the cabin was sparse, just the table with the lantern, an old wooden chair, and the remnants of a fireplace. It felt like I had stepped into a different time, a place untouched by the present. I reached for the lantern, half expecting it to vanish as soon as I touched it, but it was solid, warm. I held it up, casting light around the room, and that's when I saw them. The carvings. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the wood, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and move as the light flickered across them. They weren't like anything I'd seen before. Not quite writing, not quite pictures, something ancient. A cold chill ran down my spine. I backed out of the cabin, the lantern still in my hand, and that's when I noticed the light outside. Another one, floating just beyond the tree line, watching me, then another, and another. They flickered into view, surrounding the clearing, hovering just above the ground, closing in. Panic gripped me. I dropped the lantern and bolted for the trees, my flashlight bouncing in my hand as I ran. The lights followed, moving faster now, darting between the trees, flickering in and out of my vision. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed through the dense undergrowth, the trees closing in around me. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled back into my campsite, the RV coming into view through the darkness. I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it, as if that would keep the lights out. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, heart pounding. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the RV into darkness again. But I didn't need the light to know they were out there. I could see them, flickering through the windows, hovering just beyond the edge of the clearing, waiting. I tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. My hands trembled as I twisted the key again and again, but it was useless. The lights moved closer, surrounding the vehicle, their glow casting eerie shadows across the trees. I sat in the driver's seat, paralyzed. I couldn't leave, and I couldn't stay. I was trapped. Then I remembered something. A conversation I'd had with an old man at a gas station on my way here. He had asked where I was headed, and when I mentioned the abandoned mining town, he had warned me, his voice low and serious. Watch for the lads. If they come for you, leave something behind. Show them respect, and maybe they'll let you go. At the time, I had shrugged it off as superstition. But now I was willing to try anything. I grabbed my camera, my most prized possession, and opened the door just a crack. The lights hovered outside, brighter now, closer. I stepped out, hands shaking, and placed the camera on the ground in front of the RV. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I didn't mean to disturb anything. For a moment, nothing happened. The lights flickered, drifting closer, and I thought maybe it was too late. Maybe they wouldn't let me go. Then, slowly, the lights began to fade. One by one, they blinked out, disappearing into the darkness. The air around me felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. I didn't wait to see if they would come back. I climbed into the RV, turned the key, and this time, the engine roared to life. I drove out of Black Hills as fast as I could, not looking back. As I left the forest behind, the sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I realized that not every mystery needed to be solved. Some things, some places, were meant to stay hidden, and I would never follow the lights again. I'd always relied on logic to make sense of the world. As a wildlife biologist, I believed in science, in the cold, hard facts that explained even the most mysterious corners of nature. That's why I laughed off the local legends surrounding the springs in Bitterroot Valley when I first heard them. Cursed springs? Ghosts haunting the waters? Please, I had come to Bitterroot for research, not folklore. Reports of strange animal behavior in the valley had intrigued me. Animals acting skittish, migration patterns going haywire. Something was affecting the local ecosystem, and I wanted to know what. The springs themselves were supposed to be mineral-rich, bubbling with heat from the Earth's core. Perfect for my research. I parked my RV by a creek, not far from the springs, nestled deep in the valley where the trees were thick, and the nearest sign of civilization was miles away. I wanted isolation. Just me, my work, and nature. But from the start, something felt off. The animals knew it before I did. On my first day, as I trekked toward the springs to set up trail cameras, I noticed the silence. Normally, the forest would be alive with noise, birds, insects, the scurrying of small creatures. But here, there was nothing, just the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. I saw deer tracks, but they never led toward the springs. They veered away, as if the animals were avoiding something. I shook off the unease and set up camp, thinking I was just tired from the drive. That night, the springs seemed to call out to me. The air was warmer near them, thick and heavy, almost suffocating. The water bubbled, hotter than any hot springs I'd encountered before. I crouched by the edge, dipping my fingers in. It was unusually warm, even for geothermal springs. Still, nothing I couldn't explain. But the next morning, I noticed something strange. My cameras, normally reliable, had malfunctioned. The footage was garbled, static-filled, with only fleeting images of the animals I had been tracking. When I checked the batteries, they were completely drained, despite being fully charged the day before. It wasn't just the cameras. My GPS was acting up too, its signal jumping erratically. I was deep in the valley, but that shouldn't have affected it this much. I told myself it was just a glitch. Technology fails sometimes. But there was something about the way the springs rippled that bothered me. There was no wind, no disturbance that I could see, but the water moved, creating patterns in the surface. It was as if something beneath the water was stirring, waiting. That night, the sounds began. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or maybe a stray deer, but it was too deliberate. Soft splashing, like someone wading through the shallow waters of the springs. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the RV. The light cut through the night, illuminating the steam rising from the springs. The sound stopped the moment I shone the beam on the water, leaving the air thick with silence. I scanned the area, but there was nothing. No tracks, no animals, no signs that anything had been there. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was spooking myself with all the talk of curses, but deep down, something didn't feel right. The next morning, I found my boots placed neatly beside the RV door, though I had left them inside the night before. My field journal was open on the picnic table, pages fluttering in the wind, as if someone had been reading it. I was the only one out here. That's when I remembered the stories. The locals had mentioned a spirit, something they called the water wraith. It was said to be the ghost of a woman who had drowned in the spring centuries ago, lured there by something she couldn't resist. Some said she was sacrificed to the springs to appease the land, her spirit cursed to wander, drawing in anyone who ventured too close. I hadn't believed a word of it at the time, but now I wasn't so sure. I tried to push the thoughts away, but the strangeness continued. That afternoon, I found more footprints near the springs, bare, human-like, but distorted. The toes elongated and the heels unnaturally deep. They led right to the water's edge before disappearing. It was as if someone had walked into the springs and vanished. Determined to keep my head, I dove back into my research, trying to make sense of the animal behavior and the odd environmental shifts. But the more I focused on my work, the more distracted I became. Every night, the splashing sounds returned, louder each time. It felt like someone, or something, was pacing around the springs, waiting for me to come closer. Then, one night, I dreamt of her. In the dream, I was standing at the edge of the springs. The water was calm, the air thick with mist, and there, rising from the water, was a figure, tall, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Her hair, long and tangled, floated around her like seaweed. She beckoned to me, her lips moving, though no sound came out. The dream felt so real, like I was actually there. And when I woke, my feet were wet, as if I had been walking through the water. I stumbled outside, heart pounding, and found muddy footprints leading from the springs to the RV. They matched the ones I had seen earlier, but this time they were my size. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening here, something beyond my understanding. My rational mind screamed for answers, but the evidence was piling up in a way that defied logic. The water wraith, the cursed springs, they were real. I had come too close, and now she was pulling me in. I tried to leave the next morning, packing up my equipment and stowing it in the RV. But the moment I started the engine, it sputtered and died. The GPS still wouldn't work, and the path out of the valley had become a disorienting maze. No matter which direction I took, I kept finding myself back at the springs, as if the forest itself was leading me in circles. I was trapped. That night, as the sun set and the splashing sounds returned, I knew I had to do something. The stories I had once dismissed spoke of offerings, ways to appease the wraith, to show respect to the cursed land. It was a desperate thought, but I was out of options. I gathered what I could, my research notes, the samples I had collected, and the food I had left. I carried them to the edge of the springs, placing them carefully on the ground. The water rippled as I approached, and I could feel the air grow colder, heavier. "I'm sorry," I said aloud, my voice trembling in the stillness. "I didn't mean to disturb you." For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The water stilled, the air thick with anticipation. Then, slowly, the oppressive feeling began to lift. The night air grew lighter, the splashing sounds fading into silence. I didn't dare move, standing there for what felt like hours, until the forest around me returned to its natural state. The path out of the valley was clear the next morning. The RV started on the first try. As I drove away from Bitterroot Valley, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been spared, allowed to leave. But not without a cost. I had seen something that had challenged everything I believed about the natural world. The water wraith was real, and her presence lingered in the back of my mind, a haunting reminder that some places, some forces, are beyond our control. I wouldn't be returning to Bitterroot Valley. Some mysteries, I realized, are better left unsolved. The road stretched ahead, narrow and winding, flanked by dense pine trees that seemed to swallow up the last light of the day. Yellowstone National Park was a place of stunning beauty. Endless forests, towering mountains, and deep, still lakes. I'd driven my RV through the park before, but never this far into the backcountry. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows that danced across the rocky landscape. Perfect timing. I'd have just enough light to set up camp, and then the real work would begin. My name is Dan Harper. I've spent the last 20 years traveling, photographing wildlife for magazines, nature shows, and my own personal projects. I've been to remote places that most people never hear about. Untouched parts of Alaska, the Canadian wilderness, and the plains of Wyoming. But Yellowstone was different. There was something ancient about this place, something that demanded respect even from an old hand like me. That's why I'd come out here, to photograph wolves at night, away from the tourists and their camera phones. I eased the RV into a secluded clearing by the edge of a dense thicket of trees, about as far off the grid as I could get without venturing too deep into the restricted areas. My plan was simple. I'd stay here for a week, capturing footage of Yellowstone's elusive nocturnal creatures. Wolves, bison, maybe even a grizzly if I got lucky. I killed the engine, the silence settling around me like a blanket. The RV ticked as it cooled, the only sound breaking the quiet. I liked it this way, alone with nature, no distractions, just me, the camera, and whatever wandered into my path. The first sign that something wasn't quite right came almost immediately as I was setting up my trail cameras around the perimeter of the clearing. My GPS began acting up. The device in my hand, usually reliable, started flashing erratically, the coordinates jumping all over the screen. I frowned, tapping it a few times. Nothing. It wasn't the first time gear had malfunctioned, and I chalked it up to the remoteness of the area. The wilderness had a way of messing with technology, especially this deep in. Still, it nagged at me. I shrugged off the feeling, planting the last of the trail cams and heading back to the RV as the final light faded from the sky. I settled into my routine as darkness fell, reviewing some older footage and making sure my equipment was ready for the night. My camera batteries, freshly charged, seemed to drain faster than usual, but I had spares. By the time I noticed the strange flickers of light just outside the window, the night had fully set in. At first, I thought it was a trick of my eyes, fireflies maybe, or light reflecting off the trees. But these lights weren't natural. They blinked in and out, hovering just beyond the edge of the clearing like tiny, moving stars. I grabbed my camera, zooming in, but the lens wouldn't focus. The lights darted between the trees, faster than my camera could follow. I adjusted the settings, but no matter what I did, the picture remained fuzzy. The lights just out of reach. Frustrated, I set the camera aside and opened the door, stepping out into the night. The air was cooler than I'd expected, crisp and silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. I listened for the usual sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, but there was nothing, just the stillness. And then I heard it, a hum. Low at first, barely noticeable, but growing louder as I stood there. It wasn't like the wind or the sound of an animal. It was rhythmic, almost musical, like a chant carried on the breeze. The lights blinked in and out again, still hovering at the edge of the clearing, but I couldn't bring myself to follow them. I'm not one for superstition. I've always prided myself on being grounded, logical, but something about that sound made my skin crawl. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me, my pulse quickening. The RV felt safer, but just barely. I didn't sleep much that night. The hum faded after a while, replaced by the occasional thud outside. I told myself it was a tree branch, maybe a deer, but each thud made my heart skip. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning brought no comfort. The sunlight streaming through the window seemed too bright, too harsh, like it didn't belong here. I stepped outside, expecting the fresh air to clear my head, but what I found instead sent a chill down my spine. In the dirt around my RV were symbols, roughly carved, like they'd been scraped into the earth with a sharp tool. They weren't random either. Spirals, circles, intersecting lines that almost looked like runes. I knelt down, brushing the dirt aside, trying to make sense of it. Who could have done this? I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived, and the area was too remote for casual hikers or campers. Yellowstone was full of myths and legends, stories of spirits tied to the land, but I never paid them much mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Determined to get back to work, I grabbed my gear and hiked into the forest. My goal was simple: capture images of the wolves that roamed these parts. I figured if I kept busy, I could ignore the weirdness. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the hum returned, louder this time, and with it, the same flickering lights dancing through the trees. I tried to stay focused, scanning the ground for tracks or signs of animals, but every few steps I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye. I stopped, turning slowly, and that's when I saw them. The Watchers, tall, shadowy figures, standing just beyond the trees. Their forms were indistinct, almost blending in with the forest itself, but I knew they were there. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I raised the camera, but no matter how I adjusted the settings, the figures remained blurry, like they weren't fully real. I could feel their gaze, though, heavy, piercing. They weren't animals, that much I knew. They were something else, something ancient. The hum grew louder, and the figures seemed to draw closer, though they never moved. I stepped back, almost tripping over a root, and that's when it hit me. I wasn't alone out here. I never had been. The stories I'd heard, the warnings from the locals, came rushing back. Legends of spirits tied to the land, guardians of the forest. They weren't meant to be seen, but I had disturbed them. By coming here, by trying to capture something that wasn't meant to be captured. I turned and ran, my breath ragged as I raced back to the RV. The trees blurred around me, the hum filling my ears, drowning out everything else. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door shut behind me, my hands shaking. For the next few hours, I sat there in the silence, my mind racing. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be that simple. The Watchers had seen me. They knew I was here, and they weren't going to let me go easily. When I finally mustered the courage to start the RV, the engine sputtered, refusing to catch. I tried again and again, but each time it stalled out, leaving me stranded. The hum returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each failed attempt. I stepped outside, heart pounding, and there they were, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. Always watching. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I had to do something. I remembered the stories, the legends about how the Watchers only appeared when the land had been disrespected. Maybe I had taken something without realizing it. Maybe I had to give something back. I grabbed my camera and all the gear I had brought with me, stepping slowly toward the edge of the clearing where they stood. My hands trembled as I placed the equipment on the ground, a silent offering. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words barely audible over the hum. "I didn't mean to disturb you." For a long moment, nothing happened. The Watchers remained still, their forms barely visible in the shadows of the trees. But the air felt lighter, the hum beginning to fade, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the figures retreated into the forest. I didn't waste any time. I hurried back to the RV, my heart still racing. When I turned the key, the engine roared to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The clearing was empty, but I could still feel their eyes on me, watching from the trees. I won't come back. Yellowstone is a place of beauty, but it's also a place of power, a place where not everything is meant to be seen or captured. Some things belong to the land and the watchers. They make sure it stays that way. I've learned my lesson. I always liked being alone in nature. Something about the solitude gives me a sense of peace that no amount of socializing or city life ever could. The open road, the endless woods, the quiet hum of nothing but birds and the breeze. It's where I feel alive. That's why I bought the RV, packed my fishing gear, and drove out to Lake Lanier. It wasn't my first time camping near a lake, but I'd heard this place had a certain mystique to it. The locals talk about the lake's dark history, about the flooded towns that lay beneath the water, and the people who drowned there. I never put much stock in ghost stories, but there was something that intrigued me about this place. I pulled the RV into a secluded cove late in the afternoon. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. The trees stood tall and still, almost too still, but I chalked it up to the lack of wind. It was perfect, really. Quiet, no other campers in sight, and the lake looked like glass. I parked the RV, took a deep breath, and stretched as I stepped out into the fresh air. The place was eerie, sure, but I kinda liked that. It added to the charm. I spent the first couple of days relaxing, fishing, reading, and just enjoying the peace and quiet. But by the third day, things started to feel off. It was small things at first. My fishing line would snag on something, even when I knew there weren't any rocks or branches beneath the surface. Every time I reeled in my line, the bait would be gone, but there was never a tug or a bite. Just nothing. A couple of times, I thought I saw ripples on the surface of the lake, like someone had tossed a stone in, but there was no one around. The oddities kept piling up. One night, I was sitting by the fire, enjoying the sound of the crackling wood, when I noticed the RV lights flickering. The interior lights, which had been running fine all week, suddenly dimmed and brightened over and over, as if someone was playing with a switch. I figured it was a wiring issue and decided I'd take a look at it the next day. But the longer I watched the flickering, the more unsettled I became. It didn't feel like a technical problem, it felt deliberate. By the time the fourth night rolled around, I was starting to feel the weight of the isolation. I wasn't scared, just a little on edge. The eerie silence was getting to me. No birds, no wind, just the occasional lapping of water against the shore. That night, I decided to take the boat out. There's something calming about being out on the water under the stars. Plus, I hadn't caught a damn thing all week, and I figured I might have better luck fishing in the dark. I rowed out to the middle of the lake, where the moonlight shimmered off the water like silver. I cast my line and waited, listening to the quiet slosh of water against the hull. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but there was no mistaking what I saw. Just beneath the surface of the water, a pale hand reached up, fingers long and thin, before disappearing back into the depths. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The hand didn't pull my line. It didn't touch the boat. It was just there for a brief moment, and then gone. I didn't move for a long time, the fishing rod limp in my hand. Eventually, I reeled in the line, half expecting the hand to reappear and grab the hook. But there was nothing. Just water, black and still. I rowed back to shore in silence, every splash of the oars making my skin crawl. When I got back to the RV, I locked the doors and pulled the curtains shut. I sat at the table, staring at my fishing gear, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It had to be some sort of hallucination. Maybe I was dehydrated, or the isolation was playing tricks on me. I'd been alone for days after all. That's when the knocking started. It was soft at first, just a faint tap on the side of the RV. I figured it was a tree branch or some animal, but the knocking grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. The lake was still and the trees unmoving. I stepped outside, the cold night air prickling my skin. I scanned the shoreline, but there wasn't a soul in sight. But then I saw them. Wet footprints leading up from the lake to the edge of my campsite. Bare footprints, and they didn't lead back. My stomach turned. I wanted to believe it was some prank. Maybe a hiker who wandered too close, but my mind kept going back to that hand under the water. I followed the footprints to the water's edge, where they stopped abruptly. The lake lapped quietly against the shore, as if nothing had happened. I backed away, my heart racing, and hurried inside the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it, every lock, and turned on every light I had. The rest of the night I sat there, flashlight in hand, jumping at every little sound. I didn't sleep. By morning, the footprints had vanished, washed away by the lake, but I couldn't shake the unease. I had to know what was going on. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my gear and decided to explore a nearby part of the lake where I'd heard there were some old ruins from the towns they flooded when they built the reservoir. Maybe it would give me some perspective, something rational to explain what was happening. I took the boat out again, rowing toward a half-submerged structure I'd spotted earlier in the week. The water was unusually cold as I approached, sending a shiver up my spine. As I neared the ruins, I noticed something glinting beneath the surface. A car, old and rusted, sitting on the lake bed. It must have been there for decades, maybe since the area was flooded. Curiosity got the better of me and I slipped on my diving mask, deciding to take a closer look. I dove in, the cold water wrapping around me like a vice as I swam down toward the car. As I approached, I saw it, the inside of the car, still intact despite the years, and in the driver's seat, a shadowy figure slumped forward, its face pale and blurred by the water. I kicked upward, breaking the surface with a gasp, my lungs burning. But as I swam back to the boat, something tugged at my leg. Lightly at first, then harder, pulling me back toward the car. I thrashed, kicking wildly, and the grip loosened. I scrambled back onto the boat, panting, my chest tight with panic. I didn't look back as I rowed to shore, the feeling of cold fingers still lingering on my skin. That night, I couldn't shake the fear. I didn't leave the RV. I didn't even open the door, but the knocking returned, louder this time, more frantic, like something was trying to get in. And when I looked out the window, I saw her, standing by the lake, half submerged in the water, was a woman. Her long, dark hair clung to her face, and her skin was pale, almost bluish. Her clothes were tattered, soaked through, as though she'd just crawled out of the water. But it was her eyes that terrified me the most. Black, empty, and staring right at me. I stumbled back from the window, heart hammering in my chest. She didn't move, just stood there, watching, waiting. I couldn't stay another night. I packed up as quickly as I could, tossing my things haphazardly into the RV. But when I tried to start the engine, it sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. Panic surged through me. It was like the lake was holding me there, refusing to let me leave. Desperate, I remembered the stories I'd heard. The rumors about drownings, about the ghosts of the people buried beneath the lake. One of them was about a woman who died in a car accident. Her body never recovered. The same car I'd seen at the bottom of the lake. She was looking for something, or maybe someone. I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed my fishing gear, my flashlight, and anything I thought might have disturbed her and walked back to the shore. The drowned woman was still there, her dark eyes following me as I approached. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I didn't mean to disturb you." I dropped my gear at the water's edge, hoping it would be enough, hoping she would leave me alone. For a long moment, nothing happened. She stood there, watching, her expression unreadable. But slowly, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the water until there was nothing left but ripples on the surface. The next morning, the RV started without issue. I drove away from Lake Lanier, my hands still trembling on the wheel, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. Whatever I'd seen, whatever had happened, I knew one thing for sure. I'd never come back to that lake again. Some places are haunted, not just by ghosts, but by the memories of what was lost, and I had no intention of becoming one of them. There's something about the desert that speaks to me. It's harsh, unforgiving, just like the life I've left behind. That's why I bought the RV, threw everything I owned inside, and hit the road a few years back. Out here, I can drive for hours without seeing another soul, and that's exactly how I like it. I thought I'd left the past behind me, those long nights where I couldn't sleep, the sounds of distant gunfire still ringing in my ears. The desert was supposed to be my escape. But today, something feels different. I'm driving through the Mojave, just south of the old mining town of Calico, looking for a good place to camp. The heat radiates off the cracked earth, distorting the distant mountains. It's beautiful in its own way, but the isolation can mess with your head if you're not careful. I've always liked that challenge. Keep your wits about you. Don't let the emptiness swallow you whole. The RV sputters, and I curse under my breath. The damn thing's been acting up for days now. I pull off the narrow dirt road and into a secluded spot surrounded by rocky outcrops. The heat presses down like a weight as I kill the engine and climb out. First things first, I check the air conditioning unit again. No dice. The damn thing is toast. And out here, you don't want to mess around with broken equipment. I'll have to fix it tomorrow. Tonight, I'll tough it out, like I always do. I glance around the area as I unpack a few supplies. No one for miles, not a single sign of life except the occasional scrub brush or twisted Joshua tree. Perfect. By the time the sun starts dipping below the horizon, I've set up a fire and cracked open a beer. The sky turns from a brilliant orange to deep purple, and the stars begin their nightly show, stretching across the sky in an endless blanket of light. It's the kind of view that reminds me why I'm out here in the first place. Just me and the desert. But something's nagging at the back of my mind tonight. Maybe it's the heat, or the fact that the RV's giving me trouble, but I can't shake the feeling that something's off. I've camped alone plenty of times, but this feels different. The desert seems too quiet, like it's holding its breath. I lean back in my chair, watching the fire crackle and pop. That's when I notice it. A flicker of light out in the distance, just a small pulsing glow near the base of a rocky hill. At first, I think it's another camper. Maybe some off-roaders, but it doesn't move like a campfire. It's strange, unsteady. I shake my head. Probably nothing. Could be a reflection, or hell, maybe it's just my eyes playing tricks on me. I've been driving all day under the sun, and the mind has a way of seeing things that aren't really there. Still, I keep an eye on it. The light stays there, flickering like a dying flame, and I realize it's closer than I thought. Much closer. I stand up, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. I don't scare easy, but there's something about that light that puts me on edge. I grab my flashlight and click it on, scanning the area, but there's nothing. Just the vast desert stretching out in every direction. No one there, no one but me. I flick the flashlight off and sit back down, telling myself to stop being paranoid. But that light, it's still out there, hovering, almost like it's waiting for something. Eventually, I give up on trying to relax and turn in for the night. The RV is a damn oven inside, even with all the windows cracked, but I'm too tired to care. I toss and turn, but sleep doesn't come easy. The desert is dead silent. No wind, no insects, not even the occasional howl of a coyote. Just silence. I close my eyes, trying to let the fatigue take over, when suddenly, bang. A loud thud echoes through the RV. My eyes snap open, heart racing. I lie still for a moment, waiting, listening. Another bang, this time louder, coming from the side of the RV. I grab the flashlight and sit up, my heart pounding. Could be an animal, maybe a rock slide from the hills. I take a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but something doesn't feel right. Slowly, I push open the door and step outside, the cool desert air hitting my skin. The fire has burned low, just embers now. I swing the flashlight in a slow arc around the camp, but there's nothing. No tracks, no sign of movement. Just that damn silence pressing down on me, and then I hear it. A voice, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. It's coming from the direction of the old mining town where the light had been. But there's no wind, no breeze, nothing to carry sound. My mind starts to race. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts or spirits. I'm practical. Everything has a reason. I follow the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but as I get closer to the base of the hill, the light flickers, and I catch movement in my peripheral vision. I snap the light over, and for just a second I see it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the mouth of what looks like an old mine shaft. I freeze. The figure doesn't move. It's just there, standing, watching me. I blink, and it's gone, vanished into the shadows. Shit, I mutter under my breath, backing away. I don't know what I just saw, but every instinct in my body is screaming at me to get out of here. I hurry back to the RV, slam the door shut, and lock it. My pulse is racing, my mind a blur of confusion and adrenaline. What the hell was that? The rest of the night, I sit there in the dark, gripping the flashlight and listening. I don't hear the voice again, but that doesn't make me feel any better. By morning, I'm exhausted. I force myself to eat a quick breakfast and decide to pack up. I've had enough of this place, and I'm not sticking around to figure out what's going on. As I start packing, I glance back toward the hill. There's something there. An old mine entrance, half collapsed, with weathered wooden beams framing the opening. I didn't notice it before. The ground around it is littered with rusted tools and debris, relics of a forgotten time. Against my better judgment, I grab my gear and head toward the mine. I tell myself it's just curiosity, that I want to know what's going on. But deep down, I know it's more than that. Something pulled me here last night, and now I need to know why. The air inside the mine is cool, almost too cool, considering the desert heat outside. It smells like damp earth and something else, something metallic, like old blood. My flashlight beam sweeps across the jagged walls, revealing rusty tracks that disappear into the darkness. As I move deeper into the mine, the whispers return. They're faint, echoing off the walls, but they're definitely there. I can't make out the words, but the tone is unmistakable. Pleading, desperate. I stop, scanning the tunnel ahead, and that's when I see it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, shifting just ahead. I point the flashlight, but the light flickers and the shadow vanishes. My stomach churns and my throat goes dry. I should leave. I know I should, but something pulls me forward, deeper into the mine. That's when I see him, the figure from last night, standing in the tunnel ahead. This time, there's no mistaking what I'm seeing. His face is gaunt, skin stretched tight over bone, his eyes hollow and glowing faintly in the dim light. He's dressed in old, tattered clothes, covered in dust and soot, and his legs are twisted, mangled like he'd been caught in a cave-in. The phantom miner. The stories come rushing back. Tales I'd heard in passing about miners who died in these shafts, buried alive, their spirits wandering the desert, unable to find peace. I never believed in that crap. But standing here, face to face with something I can't explain, I'm not so sure anymore. He doesn't move, just stares at me with those glowing eyes, and I can feel his pain, his anger. He's been trapped here for who knows how long, and now he wants me to join him. I take a step back, my mind racing. I know I can't fight this thing, but maybe, just maybe, I can reason with it. I'm sorry, I say, my voice trembling. I didn't mean to disturb you. I'll leave. I'll go. The phantom miner tilts his head as if considering my words. The whispers grow louder, echoing through the tunnel, and for a moment, I think he's going to let me go. Then the walls start to shake, rocks crumble from the ceiling, and the ground trembles beneath my feet. The air fills with dust, choking me. I turn and run, heart pounding, my flashlight flickering wildly as I sprint toward the entrance. The whispers follow me, growing louder, more desperate. The mine is collapsing, and I'm barely keeping ahead of it. I burst out of the mine, gasping for air, the sun blinding me as I stumble back to the RV. I don't look back. I throw my gear inside, start the engine, and get the hell out of there. As I drive away, I glance in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I see him. The phantom miner, standing at the entrance of the mine, watching me, waiting. I don't stop driving until I'm miles away, the desert stretching out endlessly before me. My hands are still shaking, and my mind is racing with questions I'll never have answers to. But one thing's for sure, I'll never come back to the Mojave. Whatever I saw out there, whatever pulled me into that mine, it's not done with me, and I have a feeling it never will be. The desert doesn't forget. I always prided myself on my ability to handle the wilderness. I've been climbing for years, camping alone in places most people wouldn't dare set foot in. The isolation, the danger, that's where I thrived. It's what brought me to Red River Gorge, Kentucky, one of the most beautiful, rugged places I'd ever seen. Sandstone cliffs, thick forests, and, best of all, remote enough that you could go days without seeing another soul. It was perfect for what I wanted. Peace, quiet, and a week of challenging climbs. I'd parked my RV deep in the backwoods, away from the crowded areas where families came to gawk at the rock formations. No, this was for serious climbers, and that was exactly what I was. The first few days went as planned. I tackled a few moderate routes, tested my gear, and reviewed the footage I was collecting. Everything was going smoothly until it wasn't. It started small, like these things often do. My ropes were fraying, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. I maintained my gear religiously, and these were practically new. The clips I brought wouldn't lock properly, slipping at the worst moments, and my climbing boots, also new, felt strange on my feet, as though they didn't quite fit anymore. It wasn't enough to stop me, but it was irritating. I chalked it up to bad luck, though I could feel a little itch of doubt forming in the back of my mind. Then, one evening, after a particularly grueling climb, I came back to my campsite to find my gear scattered. I'd left everything neatly packed away in the RV, but when I returned, my harness was on the ground, my ropes coiled around a nearby tree, and my helmet was lying upside down in the fire pit. I stood there, staring at the mess, trying to figure out how it could have happened. There were no tracks, no signs of animals, nothing that explained it. I convinced myself that maybe I hadn't secured everything as well as I thought. It was easier than admitting something was off. Besides, I was alone, completely alone. I wasn't about to start jumping at shadows. That night, sitting by the campfire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. You know that prickling sensation you get when someone's staring at you? It was like that, but worse, heavier. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows against the trees, and I kept telling myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. I hadn't seen another person in days, after all, but then I saw them. At first, they looked like nothing more than shadows at the edge of the trees, flickering in the firelight. But as I stared, I realized they weren't just shadows. They were figures, tall, thin, and moving silently between the trunks. They stayed at the edge of the fire's reach, just beyond the light, but I could feel their eyes on me. I jumped up, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it toward the figures, but the beam illuminated nothing but trees. The shadows were gone. I stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The night was silent. Too silent. Not even the usual rustling of leaves or the distant chirping of insects. Just silence. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I hiked out to a new climb, determined to shake off the weirdness of the night before. Climbing always cleared my head, made me focus on the present. But something was different. As I hiked, I noticed strange carvings on the rocks near my roots. Symbols I didn't recognize. They looked ancient, etched deep into the stone, worn by time but still visible. I tried to ignore the growing unease gnawing at my gut. They were probably just remnants of some old tradition, nothing more. Still, the symbols seemed to be everywhere, marking the cliffs and the trees. By the time I reached the cliff, the fog had rolled in, thick and clinging to the forest like a heavy blanket. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, and the rock face I planned to climb was barely visible through the mist. But I had come this far, and I wasn't about to back out now. I set up my gear, double-checking every rope and clip. Halfway up the climb, things went wrong. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the gorge, yanking at my ropes and gear. It was so strong that I had to stop, clinging to the rock as my harness strained against the gusts. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was when I looked down. Standing at the base of the cliff, staring up at me, was one of the figures, a dark silhouette, motionless, watching me with no face, no features, just a shadow in the fog. My heart lurched in my chest, and for a split second I lost my grip. My hand slipped from the hold, and I dangled there, panic rising in my throat as I scrambled to regain my balance. When I looked back down, the figure was gone. I climbed faster after that, desperate to reach the top and get off the cliff. The wind tore at me the entire way, and by the time I hauled myself over the edge, my hands were trembling, my breath ragged. The fog was even thicker up here, swallowing the landscape in every direction. I couldn't see the path down, couldn't see anything but the swirling gray mist. That night, back at the RV, I decided to cut the trip short. Something was wrong here, something I couldn't explain. I packed up what I could, ready to leave in the morning. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. It sputtered and whined, but it wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Panic started to creep in. I was miles from any help, with no cell signal and no way to get the RV moving. I climbed out to check the engine, hoping it was just a simple fix. But as soon as I stepped outside, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching through the dead leaves behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The fog was thick, swirling around the trees, but I could feel it. Someone, or something, was watching. Then I saw them again. The figures, standing at the edge of the campsite. Tall, thin, and featureless, their dark forms barely visible through the mist. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed toward the RV. My hands were shaking. Fumbling with the doors, I tried to get inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, but I could still feel their presence. I peeked through the window, and they were closer now, just outside the firelight, their shadows blending with the trees. The fire flickered, and then, without warning, it went out, plunging the campsite into complete darkness. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't a believer in ghosts or spirits, but this was something else, something I couldn't explain. I remembered the symbols I'd seen on the rocks, the carvings that seemed older than anything I'd ever encountered. And I remembered stories I'd overheard from old climbers, legends about spirits in the gorge, ancient beings that protected the land from outsiders. I wasn't sure if I believed those stories, but I was desperate. I grabbed what little food and gear I had left and stepped outside, my heart hammering in my chest. The figures were still there, watching me from the shadows. Slowly, I walked to the edge of the campsite and laid the food down on the ground as an offering. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the thick fog. I didn't mean to disturb anything. For a long moment, nothing happened. The figures didn't move, didn't react. But then, slowly, they began to retreat, their dark forms fading into the mist. The fog seemed to lift just a little, and the air felt lighter. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the RV, waiting, watching the darkness, but the figures didn't return. When the sun finally rose, the fog had cleared, and the RV started on the first try. I drove out of Red River Gorge without looking back, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I didn't know what I'd seen, didn't know if I'd imagined it or if it was something real. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back. Some places aren't meant to be conquered, aren't meant to be explored. They belong to something older, something that doesn't take kindly to being disturbed. Red River Gorge wasn't just wilderness. It was something else, something watching, and I'd been lucky to get out.